Welcome back to exclusive content on Out There JCH Patreon. Thank you so much for supporting my work. For this first bonus content, I want to walk you through my frustrations with the MeatEater Media Group and how they're talking about race, racism, and hunting. Folks from the MeatEater bring up my work and my name in the context of their discussions about racism and hunting.
You finna get some bleeps.
I write about this in my newsletter, so if you haven't checked that out, please give the last 2 issues a read. By the end of this video, you should have a pretty clear idea of how I feel about them bringing my name up,
You finna get some bleeps.
how they're talking about this topic, and where I think this conversation should be going within the broader hunting community. So let's dive right in.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Hunting Collective, episode 89. I just got done interviewing Carolyn Finney, who wrote a book called Black Faces, White Places, White Spaces.
White Spaces, yeah.
Is the correct title. There's a lot of things that came up that I think we can talk through here. I was thinking of all the things I wish I had said, had asked.
Like you do.
Yeah, and this is something that came up, and I wish, I do regret not really diving into this in more detail with Carolyn, but we can certainly discuss it here. There's an idea that she brings up, and another writer that she is friends with named Jonathan Hall, who you'll find was on Anthony Bourdain's show and wrote an article, Hunting While Black. He's pretty direct in saying, like, I'm not comfortable going on public lands. And it's because there's white people with guns there.
Totally.
If you see a bunch of white hunters walking around in deer camp in the middle of Colorado, you're assuming that there might be inherent danger there, or there might be some inherent bias there. Like, it's a tough way to walk around in the world. And that, like, you're carrying the baggage around with you in a way that just, it has to shape your own interactions and your own perceptions of how people treat you. I don't want to write off the fact that Jonathan Hall and Carolyn Finney feel very uncomfortable walking around in public lands. I think Jonathan Hall wrote that he feels like he would have to wear triple orange. And Carolyn told a story like she just didn't want to go.
Right.
And so I get that, but at what point are you kind of manifesting the thing you don't want?
It is a tough way to go through the world. It is baggage. Where he makes the mistake, I think, in this analysis is thinking that or characterizing that baggage is something that Black people are choosing to carry. It's about trying to protect myself from violence based on my race that could come at me at any point in time. And it's frustrating to listen to this kind of thinking because it shows that Ben does not understand how race functions in society. And he seems very uncomfortable with the idea that whiteness is the thing that's doing the work in setting the stage for how I feel about being in these spaces. And then the next step is, well, what is the source of these feelings of not feeling safe in this space? And you very quickly come to the idea that it's racism that's doing that. Whiteness is creating this space of not being safe for Black people. But rather than sort of do the work to unpack that, it gets pushed back on folks like us and saying, like, I hear you, but I think you're making shit up.
But I do feel that there's some element of that present. Like, you're not going to go to someone and be like, get over it. Because once you hear Carolyn speak or some, intelligent African-Americans speak about kind of their feelings around race and the outdoors and culture, you're very quick.
Did he just call me articulate?
We come to realize, like, this shit's real, and if you write it off, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
Like, but there's also, like, some things that can be improved on that side of the coin to say, like, okay, like, don't generalize all 2019 white hunters in the way that you wouldn't want me to generalize all people on the other side.
They're not going to end up dead because of the way that I feel about white people in the woods with guns. But as we saw very clearly at the end of 2021, the feelings about a Black person by white people ended up in that Black person, Peter Spencer, being killed. So it's not the same thing. And this is not a case of the consequences of prejudice being equal. They're not.
Whether the generalization is warranted through, like, millennia of fucked up occurrences between our races, like, it's hard to continue to walk through the world like that.
You finna get some bleeps.
What the fuck are you talking about, whether or not it's warranted? Whether or not slavery was bad for Black people, whether or not Jim Crow was bad for Black people, whether or not the practice of lynching was bad for Black people, it's a hard thing for black people to continue to go around the world being the least bit cynical of white people? What? So I think like that the mental gymnastics is all about Ben's inability to accept that part of his identity as a white person, a white hunter, and a white man is contributing to something that I have and Dr. Finney and many others have articulated as being upsetting. But wait, it gets worse.
I want to help with a solution there. I'm not saying I'm not calling them out in any way, but it's just something I was thinking of.
The thing, right? Like, and let's set aside any issues of getting shot, because I think that's a little hyperbolic. I don't actually think that people in the woods, no matter how racist they are, can be like, there's a black dude, shoot him and call it an accident.
No matter how racist a group of people are, I don't think there are white people out there who would kill a black person and call it an accident. Like literally every single time in my lifetime, with very few exceptions, where a black person has been killed by white people, those white people have tried to obfuscate the cause of why they killed a black person. Like we have an entire 2.5 centuries and longer of white people killing black people in the woods or otherwise simply because of that black person's race. And Miles wants to call my concern about that reality hyperbolic. And so they are trying to justify why they shouldn't feel that way, why they should not fully accept the reality of what I am saying and have said in my writings into their own practice and identity as a hunter. Because then they'd have to deal with a lot of the baggage that they haven't claimed about what it means to be white in America. And just like for a black person, it doesn't matter that we didn't create this baggage for ourselves, but we still have to deal with it as a matter of survival. And the less that they deal with their own baggage of whiteness that they inherited, that was created for them, the less they deal with that, the better they feel.
I don't see that as a reality. And a lot of sort of internal fortitude and self-confidence to stay in that space when there are a lot of people looking at you wondering, why the hell is he here?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's easy. In many of these conversations, like we can fall into the trap of talking about wanting diversity or talking about wanting more hunters, but then falling short of actually like reaching across that aisle that exists and saying, hey, let's deal with this the way you want to deal with it instead of me dealing with this issue in the way that I want to.
I just find it really fascinating how often they approach like the precipice of dealing with this in the right way and then like do the opposite. The way that I wanted to deal with this conversation when they first invited me on was to, one, be treated professionally and not be sent an email in the middle of the pandemic to ask if I wanted to, on that same day, hop on a call to record another episode about this issue. Right? We're in the middle of the pandemic and I get an email from, the podcast saying, Dr. Finney gave us your name and we're wondering if you can talk with Ben today. Who does that? Who makes a cold call for an interview and asks the interviewee if they're available on the same day, let alone during a pandemic, and let alone without recognizing that this person might also have other things going on in their life. So that was sort of like strike number one. And then, that conversation never really came to fruition because they canceled at the last minute, like literally at the last minute. I was sat down and I was ready to record about a week and a half later, I think at noon, and I got an email at like 11:50 something saying that Ben was no longer available and were there other times that I might be able to meet and talk. No apology, no recognition that I had actually taken time out of my schedule to arrange to speak with them. Nothing. Just like, yep, we canceled. And then I followed up with questions. How do you all plan to talk about this? Because you had the conversation with Carolyn Finney, so how are you moving this conversation forward? You said what you said here. You've had this particular conversation, so how are you thinking about this in the arc of this larger conversation? So I sent them some questions and some topics and things that I would want to talk about. And I heard back from the producer saying like, thank you, I'll talk to Ben about this. And then I haven't heard anything from them since. They're not having this conversation in the way that the people who are affected by racism want to have it. They're having the conversation how they want to have it.
Let's deal with this the way you want to deal with it, instead of me dealing with this issue in the way that I want to and telling you what you should do to come be a part of this. Like, what do you want us to do? Because we care, man. Like, I care. Yeah. I think a lot of hunters care. And it's never just going to happen on its own. It's quite obvious. There's too many barriers of economic and cultural and social things that if they're not going to fall over on their own, we got to kick them over.
Who is the we that Ben is talking about here? And I think there's another rhetorical device of like white avoidance to the issues of race is there's this collective we that we're talking about that is oftentimes used to obfuscate the responsibility of whiteness in these situations. Right? I think a lot of hunters care, you heard him say. Really, he's talking about, I think a lot of white hunters care about this issue that doesn't directly affect them. Things aren't going to change unless we kick down those barriers. Black people have been kicking at these barriers and kicking down as many as we can since the founding of this country. It's white people who have not participated in anywhere close to equal measure. Once again, like the thing that sets the feelings of not being safe in these spaces being whiteness, the culprit is the same when discussing the lack of progress that's happening in dismantling racism in hunting. It's the same thing. So who is left in the we that needs to address these issues? Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to when Dr. Finney is actually on, and then I'll go to the spot in the MeatEater podcast where Steven Rinella mentions my name once, and then I'll finish up with talking about like how I contextualize all of this.
Yes, and so a couple of things I want to throw out there in no apparent order. One, if you haven't read it, and you probably have, there's a Black hunter, it's a friend of mine named Jonathan Hall, who he is a professor in West Virginia, and he wrote a piece for Rewire News called Notes from an Angry Black Hunter, Guns, Genocide, and the Stolen Ground You Own. And it is just really powerful. And he does a really excellent job, I think, of talking about, how this is personal. What I can never get away from, and Jonathan talks about this as well, is how we are perceived. Because we live in a country, 400, 500 years of history that we've never actually fully reconciled.
At no point during any of the conversations or any of the mentions of me by the MeatEater folks, they never mentioned that I'm a professor. Really appreciate the fact that Carolyn takes the time to mention other people. And that's what I try to do when I am talking about these issues. It's what I did for the MeatEater folks to say, hey, you should talk to Carolyn Finney because she wrote the book on this. I also think it's interesting that they have somebody on who they're praising as being somebody as the right person to have this conversation. And then when that person praises somebody else, they don't have that same assessment. But what is that based on? It's not based on their expertise because they admit that they haven't had these conversations. They haven't thought about these things. It's primarily based on how it makes them feel. Right? So my words, particularly in that second article, are much more direct, and I'm not playing nice. In the first article, Hunting While Black, I'm playing a little bit nice, as it being like the first thing that I've ever written for a public audience about hunting. I try not to immediately piss off white people. But in the second article, I'm like, no, that the real issue is whiteness. But they don't have that same assessment. But it's not based on their vast reading of works about race. It's based on how they feel about this issue. And by their own admission, it's very undeveloped thinking in this process. When talking about issues of race, Black people bring the personal to the table, but they also tend to bring a much wider perspective on the conversation as it's had in public. Whereas white people come to these conversations having not really thought about this issue in any sort of sustained manner, sort of like fits and starts. And they end up many of the times they end up drawing conclusions that are simply based on their comfort level. But they pass that off as an analysis that should be taken equal weight to the other people, like Dr. Finney, who have been thinking about these issues all our lives and have been writing about these issues.
So if we talked about you weren't allowed to go into a movie theater in the 40s or 50s, you also weren't allowed to go on the beach, the same beach as white people during the 40s and 50s in some places. The fact of the matter is it didn't make a difference if it was a beautiful park or beautiful woods to go hunting in. If you were non-white, there were different kinds of risks you were taking. I have to tell you, whether it was reasonable or not, I didn't go out. even with that on, because I thought to myself, and after Jonathan's article, and I said, I don't know how I feel about that. Meaning I just, hunters, like everybody else, are individuals, and individuals with their own set of biases. We are all biased, right? And frankly, I just didn't want to be out in the woods by myself, even with that. It would probably be fine.
Yeah,
But the fact that I even have to consider it, that's what right?
Yeah, Jonathan says that in his article. He's like, I don't hunt public land because white men with firearms and a reason to discharge said firearms make me incredibly nervous. That is something like I would never have thought of that.
A black woman just got shot in her own home and killed. I mean, for me, these are not unassociated.
Yeah.
So, do I feel am I going to feel any more safe and protected out in the woods?
Like, to call for that is absolutely appropriate in every way, and like calling for that in this day and age seems to make people uncomfortable. And I know that Jonathan Hall in his writing is talking about can we have a conversation about what justice looks like in the aftermath of genocide and anti-black violence? We talk about this in like feeling welcome on public lands and what it really is. And he said the answer from the hunting community has been a definitely loud but silent no.
Yeah.
And I see his I don't know that this has been collectively thought about or talked about enough. I don't know that there's been a no. There just hasn't been a push to be like, there has been a push to say, we want a more diverse hunting community. We want more people to come and experience this thing that we think makes our lives better. We want them to get their food in this way, but we're just not sure how to do it. And we don't know how to have the conversation about the past because it gets a little scary.
Man, you finna get some bleeps.
You literally read my words, and then you said, well, I don't know if it's a no, but we just haven't talked about it because we, white people, not black people, we, white people, don't know how to have the conversation, and it makes us scared. How many episodes of your podcast? This is episode 89 of the Hunting Collective podcast. This is the first time that you talk explicitly about blackness. This show ran for another 90 episodes. They got up into the 170s. And I've checked the episode titles. You all have not talked about this issue since then. You haven't been talking about this. It has been silent. Somebody's drowning in the water, and they say, will you please help me? A person who says no and walks away makes no difference than a person who says nothing and walks away, or says, well, I'm kind of scared to do that, and then walks away. We don't know how to have this conversation. Yeah, I know you don't know how to have this conversation. This is part of the reason why I wrote what I wrote, to get y'all to talk about this stuff, to get y'all to think about this stuff, so you couldn't just sort of like hide it. The answer is no. It's not explicitly no, but it's implicitly no. Because you've only talked about this topic once. James Baldwin says, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do. Y'all don't care about this. This is not something that you are prioritizing. Quit playing with me.
All these things are impacted by a history that we have yet to reconcile.
Yeah, that term reconcile is really, it seems like it's striking in a lot of ways, and what you talk about. And I was just looking at Jonathan Hall's article.
Yes.
I remember that he was on Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, an episode that I saw and that I thought was really great.
Oh, yeah.
And he says 90% of the land is owned by white Americans. There's this feeling, at least in my mind, if I could just make it personal for me, because I think there's a lot of people that are probably in my position where, like, listen, we celebrate. I sit on the board of an organization called Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and we celebrate public lands. I mean, that's what we're all about. Access is a huge term within our space.
Yeah.
And when I think of access, I don't necessarily think of the history of access. I think of this emblematic public place where anyone can go if they so desire. But what I have never addressed in my own mind, and I think what maybe is scary to think of, is the cultural baggage that comes with these things. And that's just something I've never thought about because I've never been faced with it personally.
Right. And that was for me, that was beautifully said. That's it. That's why I say in my most generous way, we don't know what we don't know. If I was going to be a little kind of tougher with it, I would say privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. And everyone has privilege. I want to be really clear about this too.
I mean, you can hear how carefully Dr. Finney is moving through this conversation. Dr. Finney is navigating all of these booby traps, these ways that white people are triggered into indignant defensiveness and silence about this issue, right? But that's part of the issue. The fact that white people are very slow to recognize that there is an entire sort of like conversation and consciousness that's happening within most black people who are thinking about and talking about these things that white people don't see. And then to enter into these conversations and to have the fact that like you are playing checkers, many black people and people of color, indigenous folks who are moving through these same spaces are like doing quantum physics in our heads based on the complexities of what we see. Y'all need some more humility in these conversations. And feelings aren't facts, right? I mean, they are and they aren't, right? You feel a certain way about these sorts of things, but that doesn't give you the right to carry those feelings forward without examining them, without testing them against the background of understanding of what's actually happening, right? Don't rush ahead and say, well, you know, what Jonathan said makes me feel uncomfortable and is a little direct and I think it's hyperbolic. Like, pump your brakes and be like, well, wait a minute. I feel like it's hyperbolic, but is it? Because Dr. Finney and Jonathan can marshal a lot more knowledge about, you know, how black people have been harmed than I can. They know a lot more about this history than I do. They've clearly written about this more than I have. And, they have PhDs.
We really should have an expectation that this thing can be better. And I believe this is one of the ways it can. I do not subscribe, people that know me, to social justice, like in the way that it's manifested itself in this world. There are a lot of really good things we can change. There's one big swath of this country that is going about it in the wrong way. Like they're using victimhood as a way to gain power. And like there's a lot of shit that I don't agree with. I push that all aside in this conversation. Like I push that all aside. I'm like, okay, this is an equation. Like currently what we're doing ain't working. And I don't have the numbers of growth of African-American hunters in it.
Wait a minute.
You finna get some bleeps.
It's just wild how much animosity some white people are able to hold against the fight for equality and social justice, at the same time being able to recognize that oppressive systems exist. The amount of fear and hatred and I don't know what else somebody has to feel to say that they do not at all subscribe to social justice and how it's manifested in the world today, and that there is a whole swath of the population who's going about it the wrong way, and they're using victimhood to claim power. That is some powerful make-believe. I don't know how a person can have that idea on so far an end of the spectrum and then have a conversation with somebody who's speaking exactly to why that idea that they are holding needs to be dismantled. How can you have a conversation with someone like that? And it's just fascinating and so revolting. Like clearly Ben thinks that social justice means something other than what it actually is, but he doesn't even have the wherewithal in whatever sort of like racist fever dream he's caught up in to make the distinction about what he means by social justice, right? Because social justice can be inclusive of the neo boogeyman to racist white people of Black Lives Matter movement and these sorts of social justice movements, right? It can be inclusive of that, but it's also inclusive of Martin Luther King Jr., right? So if I were to have a conversation with Ben, I would ask him, like, if you don't subscribe to social justice, then what do you call the civil rights movement? If you don't subscribe to social justice, how do you describe Rosa Parks? How do you describe the contributions of Black people throughout the history of this country in fighting for their freedom? How do you describe the abolition of slavery in the United States? Is that not a social justice movement? Because this is probably the most shocking moment of the entire podcast. On the one hand, I'm disappointed that I haven't and probably won't have an opportunity to talk with him about this. But on the other hand, like, why would you want to talk to somebody who says something like this and doesn't have enough sense to know that what they've said is completely fucked up and nonsense?